We're going to be talking about the Bible tonight. In part, I do have a particular person that we're looking at, but the biographical information on him is very sketchy. However, the paper trail that he's left behind is not. And so that's what we'll look at for a few minutes. So we're going to start here. I have in my hands here, I have the English Standard Version. Does anybody have a Bible other than that version? The Net Bible. What do you have there? The New King James Bible. Anybody else? And a New International Version. That's what you got there. That's going to be the King James, right? The authorized version. Authorized to be read in the churches, that's right. Everything. Okay, and she holds up the phone. What do you make of that? What do you make of the fact that when I'm preaching, or when John preached last week, or when Ken preaches this week, that in the congregation there's probably going to be 7 to 10 different versions that are being read. So, which version should we use? I'm sure this is a discussion that the church has had many times in the past. I want to start with a different question. And that's not which version should we use, but which text should we use? That's a slightly different question, but equally important. So when we look at why so many translations, you have to understand that. Oh, I don't have my phone with me. It doesn't matter. Barb, hold up your phone. Everybody's got one of these. There are a lot of us in here who remember when Ma Bell ruled the roost, right? And when Ma Bell decided to break up, what happened? Oh, my word. There's this plethora of companies out there trying to do the same kind of work. So, what happened was, up until 1881, precisely, from 1611, you had the authorized version says what? It's authorized to be read in the churches. I have an original text. I don't have an original 1611. But I do have an original text for the 1611. You should read it sometime. It's quite fascinating. But from 1611 to 1881, you could read any version that you wanted, because it was all the King James. There wasn't anything else. But in 1881, there were these two fellows that got together, and they looked at some of the Greek manuscripts they had found, and their names were Westcott and Hort, and they very long names actually, and I don't even know what they are, but it's one of these, John Preston Valley Hort or whatever. But anyway, they got together, and then you had a new Bible translation that came out of that. And it was also essentially the authorized version as such, the Revised Standard Version. Very literal, good work too. But since then, what's happened is scores of Bibles have come out. Okay, any number of reasons. One, language changes. Language has changed in our lifetime. Not only in our lifetime, but very and not very long ago. Just think of all the computer lingo that we use. My favorite thing on language changing, which was great, was this movie called Hidden Figures. I don't know if you saw Hidden Figures, but you had the computer department. And the computers were people, right? They weren't machines, they were computer. You're a computer. You you computed, and then you had the machine. I love that. But there are all kinds of things associated with computers as well. Language changes. It's changed in the moral sense of the word as well. Okay, so then you have differences in translation philosophy. Okay, so there are different ways that people understand translations altogether. What are some of the things that you already know about translation philosophy? How a work is translated?
Some translate word for word. Some translate thoughts.
So if you had a spectrum, right, you would say you had word for word, and then you had like a full thoughts, meaning, okay? So I know at least Ron has done translation work. What are some things in German that you just couldn't carry over into English? Okay, all right. Now that kind of language is not allowed in here. Okay, so Schadenfreude. Okay, so what does that mean literally?
It's kind of like taking pleasure in what misery somebody else experiences.
Okay, and so we don't. Do we have? It is a bad word, right? If you were translating that into English, what would you say? It's difficult. Yeah, yeah. How about Spanish? Any Spanish speakers? No. Okay. What's something in Spanish that just does not translate into English? Do you have an example?
One of my favorites is like no tengo ganas. It basically means like I don't feel like it.
You don't feel like it. You don't have it. That's straight.
But it doesn't mean that.
But it means that.
Okay.
Now, is that the verb to be? The verb to be doesn't translate.
It does not translate.
You just have to know.
Prepositions are very idiomatic.
They're very yeah. So they don't translate directly, right? So in English you would say, I'm hungry.
So you translate that to Spanish, in your translation, you are hunger.
Oh, you are hunger. Like that, yeah. Interesting. I think that the point is well made, though, that if you talk about, I want a literal interpretation or a literal translation of the Bible, you immediately run into difficulties, as we've seen right here, because Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic are all languages that are idiomatic. They have these kinds of phrases that don't make sense at all unless you translate them in a meaning sense. On the other hand, if you go too far from the literal and over to the meaning, you can end up all the way into paraphrase. Now, a paraphrase is not a translation. However, it's still on the same meaning spectrum. And so one of the reasons we end up with a lot of these is a difference in translation philosophy. So the English Standard Version is a more literal translation. The most literal, I think, is the New American Standard. It's probably the most literal. And then when you talk about translations, as you're going to the right, they kind of start dissolving. The New International Version is in the middle, where it's a dynamic equivalent translation, but it also has some areas where it is more literal. But then once you get past, I don't know, because it starts getting fuzzy on the right end of the spectrum there with notions that, like, people will say the Living Bible or something is a translation. It is not. It's a paraphrase. Then you also have differences in manuscript philosophy. So, and when we're going to talk about that just a little bit. And then the way to understand whatever translation you decide to use is this: something was lost in the translation. Something is always lost in the translation, which is why you need at least two. I would have some kind of more literal, and then I would have somewhere in the middle, like the NIV. So this word for word, that's called formal equivalence. But there are some reasons why we wouldn't put that from Greek or Hebrew into English. So, for example, a particularly brutal event in the Old Testament, in Hebrew, murdered. Somebody would say he murdered them. In Hebrew, it would say, and murdering him, he murdered him. It was like an intensive. Let's just say the word twice in a different way, so you get the idea that this wasn't just any old murder. This was like, this was a bad murder. Or you go in Galatians, where a passage where it says, who has bewitched you, or who has tricked you, or whatever, when it actually says, who gave you the evil eye? And we don't do the evil eye in English, okay? So it doesn't make sense to us, and so we can't do that. So you have word to word. What are some idioms that we have in English that absolutely make no sense? It's raining cats and dogs. Cool as a cucumber. Cool as... Costs an arm and a leg. Once in a blue moon. When the cows come home. What was that? When pigs fly. Other languages are that way as well. Like, so for example, in Arabic, if you're in Iraq and you want to say how you're doing, spoken to a male, you would say shlonek. Spoken to a female, shlonek, doesn't matter. But the point is, it means, what's your color? And what do you think the answer is? My color is this, or my color is that, like blue, cool, or whatever. No. It's fogenagel, which means I'm on the top of the palms. And you go, how does what's your color equate to being on top of a palm tree? All right? In Jordan, when you ask, how are you doing? You what you actually say is, how's your health? And the answer is, I'm laid out, meaning I've been knocked out and I'm unconscious on the floor. It means everything's copacetic, right? All is well. So they're not related. They're not necessarily related to one another. Greek is the same way. Hebrew's the same way. I mean, think about hold your horses. Or even some of the little sayings that we have. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And you go, what in the world? How would you translate that? It's a difficult challenge, isn't it? So with the formal, you've got the King James, the New American Standard, the New King James, and the English Standard Version. Say one more word about this. There's no such thing as a literal translation. That's part of the point that I'm trying to make. It does not exist. Let's just take the English word key. So, what does key mean? Okay, that's a key. But it could be, it could be the key point. Okay, so you got an actual key. You got a key like a main or. I'm not. Yes. So exactly. So when you have a word, any word in English, Greek, or Hebrew, what it will have is what's called a range of meaning. So it depends on the context. So there's only about 7 other different ways. Or I learned a sentence one time, I won't get it right, but it's that he banked at the bank by the bank something, where you use bank 5 times in a row and it means 5 different things. The bank of a river, the bank where you do money, how you bank a car, that kind of thing.
Example of the dangers of word for word translation, literal word for word. If you take that piece of furniture that you have in your bedroom, the chest of drawers, and translate it literally word for word into some other languages, I think you're talking about bosom of underpants.
That's right. What's the text in beginning? The beginning of the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Technically, that could be translated as the news began with a smearing of oil, or the news that began was smeared with oil, or something like that. You go, no. You gotta. So you have that. Then you have functional equivalents, thought for thought, and that's the where you have the NIV and the New Living. And then you have paraphrase, which again is not a translation, but so many people use them that I wanted to put it in this whole thought process. The Living Bible, the Good News Bible. So to get to the question that I asked originally, not which version but which text, it goes to this: the Textus Receptus you've probably heard of. What you may not know is that it was based primarily on Latin. In fact, he was so pumped up about the Latin that the Greek was almost an afterthought. How many extant, that means how many existing versions, manuscript versions of the New Testament do we have? Ballpark figure. What have you heard? What's that?
40,000.
That's a little high, but it's in the thousands.
Are you talking about fragments or whole?
I'm talking about, well, I guess it would include, it depends on how you define a fragment, but the manuscript evidence for these reasonably whole is about 5,000. So this fellow used how many? Take a guess. It's under 10. Yeah. 6, and he tweaked a 7th. Okay? His primary thing was all the Latin translations. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the Latin translations were good. After all, he said, what better way to speak Paul than Latin with Latin, right? This right here is the Ryland's Papyri. This is the oldest thing we got right here. I learned it was between 90 and 120 AD. I'm going to stick with that. Some other people have come out now and said, no, it's later than that. But what would you expect? That's what critical scholarship, and when I say critical, I don't mean like critical thinking. I mean more like critical in the negative sense. There's no supernatural. Christianity wasn't that organized that early, so, some priests got together and wrote this thing. So you have the Textus Receptus, which form the King James. And then what happens is, and this is where Westcott and Hort come in. They found these three versions, okay? One of them they found in Alexandria. One they got, I'm not sure they know where they got it from, somewhere in the Middle East, but anyway, it ended up in the Vatican, old. The one in Alexandria, Egypt, old. And then they had another one from the Sinai Peninsula, old. So you end up with these three different versions, and so older is better, right? Older is more accurate, right? Yeah, maybe. You know what we can say clearly? Older is older. So it all depends on what's in them. But what happened was the scientific community, they jumped all over this and they said, yea, verily, old is better. And so consequently, the manuscript philosophy was that we're going to base the Bible, to include this one, the English Standard Version, to include all the Bibles in this room, with the exception of the King James and the New King James, are based on these three documents, or three families, but they're itty bitty tiny families. And so that's the manuscript philosophy. So some said, no, you've got to have more. Some said, no, these three will do fine. The problem that you ran into was I don't want to use the word coincidence, but the problem you ran into is the unfortunate timing of Darwin and these early texts and this notion, anti-supernatural notion. So what happened was higher criticism developed. Now, higher criticism is fine. Got no problems with that, because higher criticism says, hey, who wrote this book? Where was it written? When was it written? Those are legitimate questions. Those are good questions. However, when you treat the Bible as a piece of literature, and that's all it is, then you end up with all kinds of wackiness. Like there's no such thing as Isaiah. Isaiah was not a real person. Can't you guys get that through your minds? Isaiah was like a whole company. Isaiah was like us. And we got in a room and we sat down and we said, we need to teach some truths to Israel. So let's start writing some stuff. What are some good stories that will be like Grimm's fairy tales, right? I don't mean to belittle it that much, but that's what it is. I happen to believe Isaiah was a real guy, okay? I think he wrote a book. I didn't think he wrote two of them and somebody put it back together, or somebody else wrote another one and they put it back together. I happen to believe the Bible is, I don't know, true. So I'm not a higher criticism kind of guy, but the lower stuff I am. That lower means textual criticism. What are the words that are there? How do you get them? Where do they come from? And so for example, Noah's Ark, you can actually see higher criticism in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And if you go to the earliest versions of the Encyclopedia Britannica, I think the first was in like 1771, you look up Noah's Ark and guess what you find? What do you think you find? Yeah, you find a boat. You find Noah and the ark and a justification saying that based on the cubic square footage and this and that and the other thing, limited to species and not animals and da-da-da-da-da, they'll all fit. Okay? By 1800, it's, you know, you go up to, by 1900, boom. Boom. Nobody believes this anymore. This is a fairy tale. This is a myth. That's higher criticism in action. Okay? So, you have the differences in manuscript. So we talked about these, and then philosophy. We talked about this. But then you have this one right here, the majority text. So the majority text is different from the Textus Receptus. So the Bible that you have, the Authorized King James Bible, and the Bible that you have are not based on the same text. The one was based on the work of Beza and Erasmus. The other one was based on the work of our guy that we're talking about tonight. Which one? These are some general rules. More scholars versus one person, better, right? A diverse group versus one group, better. Word for word versus thought for thought. My opinion, better. Simple text versus a study Bible, better. That last one, why do you think I wouldn't really recommend a study Bible?
Because you've got uninspired notes in it. They look like they're part of the text.
They're in the text, they're uninspired. And for me, the reason is, why let someone else think for you? Particularly as it relates to application, illumination, understanding what the Holy Spirit gives to you. Now, if they say, okay, this was a town in, some place that you never heard of. Okay, I got that. It's, there's some factual data. But for the most part, read the Bible before you read the commentary. Okay, so, and readability. I had to get, this is as big a print as I can get. I can't read this. Even with my glasses, it's hard to read. The person who, some of you may never have heard of this man. Some of you may not have ever heard of him, Zane Hodges. He and a fellow by the name of Farstad completely went through all 5,000 of those manuscripts. They went through all of the traditions. So they went through the Byzantine tradition, the Western tradition, the Vaticanus, the Sinaiticus, and they went through all of it, and they determined what the majority text was. And then based on the majority of text, that's where the New King James Bible came from. Now, I personally, I'm not an expert in the field. I studied enough to give me a headache in seminary, but this is what I do know. No matter where you come down, and there are issues. There are issues. No matter where you come down, on which text you come down with, no major doctrine is affected at all. Zero. So whatever translation you're holding in your hand, you can hold it with confidence that the truths of the Word of God are there, provided it's a translation. Some of these paraphrases get a little wacky, but any translation. He was one of my professors at seminary too. So Zane Hodges, yeah. He was refused to get his doctorate, even though he taught Greek exegesis for 40 years, because he felt it was just polishing your star, and he was quite the guy. Ministered in an assembly up there in Dallas for 50 years. He's gone now. So there he is as a young chap. At least he's smiling in this one. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes. Any questions before I let you go to the ball game? Take me out to the ball game.
I don't know if you heard of the new translation there. based on hearsay, it's called Word on the Street.
Not familiar.
It was a joke.
Word on the street. Okay. That's the problem, is there are so many versions out there. If you put international and you put testament, or you put word, or now street. See, now if you'd have said the New International Word on the Street, you know, you get some traction. Do you have a question?
Remember when we were just firm King James Version?
Yes.
And then the NIV came out.
Yeah.
And the church that we up in Alaska had this big, huge kerfuffle. But then you were going through university and you did a reading study.
I did a readability study. I think I mentioned this in one of my sermons in case you didn't hear it. I did a readability study because I was very much King James user. And I still feel it's the pinnacle of the English language. But so as part of my research, I had to do readability studies on a whole variety of books. I was in education. At that point, I was taking a class. It was primary ed. And you had to figure out, okay, if you're going to give a kid a book, and is the kid's, you know, able to read the thing or not? You got to figure out what the level was. So I said, you know what, if this works there, I'm going to do it on the Bibles. And so I did the King James Bible, and it was first year postgraduate study. And I said to myself, no. So the NIV, somebody take a guess. Eighth, ninth grade, that's right. Let's go to the heavy hitter, New American Standard. It's 11th grade. Yeah. ESV, 10th, 11th grade. Yeah. So that's what you have, and then when you hit the King James, your postgraduate studies. Literal, your word for word is going to be your New American Standard. I like the ESV. It's almost as close. Readability suffers a little bit because it's literal, and you're going, of him of whom he spoke, and you're going, what does that mean? What does that even mean? You had something, Barbara?
What about New King James?
The New King James is my personal. That's my personal favorite. Yeah. I'm a majority text guy. Doesn't matter though. That's why I wanted to say it doesn't matter.
Do you have the readability score for the New King James?
It's 9th grade. Well,
Is King James the only one that's based on the majority text?
it's the only one. Hodges was the only majority text guy at Dallas Seminary too. They're all critical text folks. And again, that's certainly not a criticism. It's just the reality. Real briefly, one of the things, and then I'll close in prayer because I honor the time, is that you have in 1 Timothy 3:16. Somebody quick read 1 Timothy 3:16.
And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory.
Okay, what version are you reading?
KJV.
The KJV. All right. What do you have, Dick? Do you have it?
Yeah. Beyond all question, the mystery of godliness is great. He appeared in a body, was vindicated by the Spirit.
Did you catch the difference? The majority text says God. The critical text says He. So you have, not that it's not, the doctrine itself isn't impacted, but you have about 3,900 of those little things. And so some people prefer one or the other. So, well, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you so much for your word. We thank you and stand truly in awe of the fact that through 2,000 years of history that your word is accurate, it is true, it is precious to us, that no matter what version we read, not one single doctrine is changed. It all rings true. And Lord, in none of them at all, period, is the gospel changed in any way. We thank you for that. We praise you through Christ our Lord. Amen.